afternoon to everybody. Can I apologise for being slightly late back? As you probably can anticipate, we were considering the questions that we have received in relation to this morning's hearing, and that took a little longer than we had anticipated. So, with those apologies, when you're ready, Mr. Gale.
Thank you very much, my Lord. Before we broke for lunch, I'd indicated that before we get to the questions that have been submitted, I'd like to touch on just a few matters, ending with asking you to give your giving your concluding thoughts, having sat through the last day and a half. Can I ask, first of all, in relation to one of the latter questions that we posed for you, which proceeds on the basis of building trust in society in any future decision to lock down. Now, I think probably all of you have expressed a view about that, but this may be allied to a more general concern about the public's respect for political decision makers, and as might be thought, and I think has been alluded to, the increasing polarization of political views. Professor Kearney, could I just ask you first of all about that, your views on that?
Yeah, I was just looking at my written response in terms of trust in society. The response I gave in writing was about trust in relation to inequalities. So I think that's a wider issue about that there's a non-trivial population that will not have any trust in government to the extent that they'll engage with it, or you could expect any communication to get there. I think that's quite a narrow focus there. I think the wider question of trust would be the Scottish Government used a surveys of public trust in it as a proxy of how well things are going for some time. And it tended to find that people trusted the Scottish Government more than the UK Government. Now, I'm sure if you're sceptical, you would then think, okay, well, that's what they commissioned to find. But I don't think it was an artefact of the way they did it. I think it was more about there were certain ways of maintaining trust that you could anticipate, such as regular, clear communication, a sense of doing the right thing and being seen to be doing the right thing. You know, those kind of things. I think they do matter. I know they sometimes seem kind of old-fashioned, this idea that you should be seen to do the right thing, but I think they do matter. I think in terms of lessons about trust, the only other thing I would say would be that I reckon that the Scottish Government got a little bit lucky in terms of how things unfolded on that question, because the UK Government lost a lot of trust in terms of some decisions it made, but also it was seen to be not doing the right thing, or, you know, with certain individuals not being punished for breaking COVID rules and that sort of thing. So Dominic Cummings was the obvious one. So the Scottish Government had an equivalent experience there, but the difference was that person resigned. And I think that's a case where it wasn't to do with their governance, it was to do with someone else doing the right thing.
Thank you. Lord Sumption, could I ask you, I know, having read your books, probably inherent in a lot of what you've said, certainly in your books, is a concern about the level of political debate as it is now occurring and has generally, in your view, I think, deteriorated over a period of time. Do you think that has any relevance to the continuing public support for decisions that are taken in public health emergencies?
Well, I think it has some relevance, but one of the problems, as I mentioned in a different context this morning, was the politicisation of issues that really don't lend themselves to politicisation, and that undoubtedly undermined confidence in the political process and in the process of debate, because it meant that people tended to align themselves with the view which corresponded to their more general opinions about politics, and that I think was unhelpful. Looking at it more generally, I think that trust in non-political institutions in the UK, and I think this is true of both England and Scotland, is by European standards fairly high. Trust in political institutions, in politicians generally, is low, which is, I'm afraid, characteristic of almost all modern democracies, and maybe due as much to the excessive level of public expectations as it is to the defective standards of politicians. I think one should be careful not to generalize too much, particularly from the English experience of politicians during the pandemic. The period of the Johnson government was a very untypical period in our modern history, and I suspect will remain untypical for quite a long time to come.
Thank you very much. I'm not, with respect, going to ask the other panelists to give a view on that, but what I would like to do is finally to ask you whether your experience either over the last 2 days or generally since the pandemic hit has changed. And can I ask you to consider that in light of something that I'm going to put on the screen? This is a document, it's SCI EPB 000017, and it's an extract from the book. I think it was Lord Sumption made reference to it. It'll come on the screen. This is a book that Lord Sumption made reference to yesterday. It's a book by two professors of political science at Stanford, Professor Stephen Macedo and Professor Francis Lee. And I'll simply, in order to get this into the note of our evidence, I will read this out, and you've all been asked to have regard to this overnight. And it's a passage from page 5 of that book, and really it's in the introductory section, obviously. And the authors say this: in COVID's wake, there has been a reluctance to ask hard questions, not simply about the choices that were made, but about the quality of the debate and deliberation that surrounded them. Given the magnitude of the COVID crisis and the unprecedented nature of government's responses to it, there have been remarkably few university conferences taking stock of what was done and to what extent those responses succeeded or failed. This dearth of reflection is itself a sign that something is wrong. The next paragraph. As we weigh these questions, we need a wider public conversation about how pandemic policies were made, as well as their social and economic costs. We also need greater willingness to acknowledge profound uncertainties, greater toleration of disagreement, and recognition of the reasonableness of people with varying views on such questions. These discussions could and should have taken place in legislatures across the country and elsewhere. Making policy responsibly requires a politics prepared to recognize and respect the extent of scientific uncertainty, as well as the complexity of the values at stake and people's differences concerning their weights and priorities. We need a more honest politics of crisis policy making, a politics more respectful of the profound differences between citizens and their varying circumstances, interests, and needs. Now, it seemed to us that did rather encapsulate many of the matters that we've been discussing over the past 2 days. So I'll simply go around the table. Professor Parker, to what extent have your views changed? And if you've got a comment on what I've just read, perhaps you would give us that, please.
Is my understanding you're going to come back to us later for our final sort of reflections,
Yes,
or is
yes.
it okay? So it's a separate set. I mean, largely, I agree with this. I think there might be reasons why, as a society, but also as academics and others, why we needed to put a bit of space and time between ourselves and the experience. So I think we shouldn't underestimate. Coming back to the question of fear yesterday and emotions, it feels actually today to me, this being here felt like quite a good opportunity to reflect from a bit of distance. I think earlier reflection would have been helpful, but I can understand why these things take time, and I can understand to some degree why academics haven't done this work. That's not to say they shouldn't have done. I just can understand why it hasn't happened. I agree with this, but I also agree with some of these things happen should have happened. Open debate and deliberation of difficult issues. It's not just about complex values, it's also about really difficult value judgments that require us to have a difficult, sensible public debate. So, for example, I've been struck in my experience, at least, for example, about the difference between the discussion, the experience of COVID, and the recent discussions about end of life, for example, which I felt have been interesting, sophisticated, and public in ways that have been actually very useful, and so I think we needed more of that kind of conversation about these things. So and obviously as an ethicist, I would argue strongly that these value questions really are central. So the big decisions that were made were essentially value judgments. One final thought is, and maybe this is taken from my final reflections, is that I do think we need to remember that the range of emergencies goes beyond infectious disease is one kind of emergency, but of course there's always the possibility of nuclear accidents, etc., etc. So I think many of the things we've said here should also be part of wider preparedness.
Professor Wilson?
So, yeah, I would agree with what Professor Parker just said, and the attitudes expressed in the book, I think I would broadly agree with as well. I think maybe the suggestion that there hasn't been enough discussion, I think maybe I would take slight issue with that. It seemed that for anybody who was an academic who lived through COVID, that the experience of, as it were, sort of whether sort of teaching, kind of working on publication at the time, there was such a glut of COVID-related publications at the time that I feel that maybe people were just a bit sort of exhausted, or maybe in other contexts people have talked about moral injury, and there may be a sense in which people needed to put things aside for a year or two in order to come back on them, so that reflect with fresh eyes on them, doing exactly what we've been doing over the last couple of days. And so that I don't think I've changed my mind in a deep way as a result of the conversation we've had, but maybe I've been impressed by the quality of the conversation we've had, and almost the respectful way in which we've had it. And that maybe one thing that's become apparent is that maybe there's some underlying disagreements about what the facts were, or who should have known what at what time. But there's also been a degree of disagreement about the values, not so deep and unbridgeable disagreement about values, but rather realising while we're all adhere to basically sort of similar values, how we weigh those in particular contexts may be different, and that's maybe what we need to have further discussion about. I think that what we've done over the last day and a half has been very useful from that, but at the same time I think there's probably more to be said, for example, about how to weigh up the value of liberty against that of equality or protecting people who are vulnerable. My sense is we've only begun to kind of get to the heart of those particular issues.
Thank you. Professor Busby.
Yes, thank you. I found the excerpt from the book extremely interesting, actually, and I do agree with most of what is there. Again, I would, in relation to academic discourse, for want of a better word, on this topic, I think it's happening. I think it has happened. I think it continues to happen. I think there has been a period of reflection. We've dealt with it in real time in the same way that the rest of the population has. So we have also experienced the impacts of it in our day-to-day academic lives through the effects it's had on our students, for example, and how life has changed for them, and how they have been affected in terms of mental health, anxiety, and so on. So dealing with all of that, I think, does make me reflect on what might happen next in terms of the practice of being an academic, the teaching and learning practice, as alongside the sort of research that we might do in relation to this. So I think there probably is still that round of academic conferences to come, I'm sure. What really struck me is the point about the wider public conversation about how pandemic policies were made. I've said all the way through the last couple of days that I firmly believe that we should have had more consultation, and we should continue to have more consultation and participation from members of the public. My view on that hasn't changed. In actual fact, it's been strengthened by much of what I've heard from the other panellists. I found that the discussion we've had has been really interesting and informative for me, in particular about the quality and reliability of data that might drive decision-making, and how successful certain policy approaches were, and the alternative approaches available to those that we used in the last pandemic. And I would come back to that point about asking the people affected, because I have seen in other places, actually in some of the evidence submitted to this inquiry, very good suggestions from people who were directly affected in particular ways about alternative things that could have happened but didn't happen. And I think we should collect that data and take note of it in future decision making.
Thank you very much. Professor Kearney.
Yeah, so okay, so we've got to be short and punchy. So I think public debate is a mythical thing. I think the more tangible thing is something that is well considered and structured, that's inclusive. So I think a lot of the things that we've talked about today about inequalities, for a proper public debate, it needs quite a lot of investment to make sure lots of people's voices are heard, and a clear endpoint for all that activity. And I think, so I'm so used to saying that there's only so much resource to have a proper public debate on a very small number of issues that reaches a non-trivial point. And so COVID obviously would represent something like that. But I wouldn't underestimate the amount of work it would take to facilitate a public debate that was worth doing. The second thing would be, well, how do I say this while talking at an inquiry? There are two forms of inquiry. Maybe they're both going on at the same time. One is very much, you have an inquiry for accountability. You identify what went wrong and who is to blame. And it encourages a culture of adversarialism and defensiveness. So, for example, if you have that, let's say that's the UK one, then you have governments essentially providing evidence to that committee as if defending a court case. And that's certainly the impression that I got from from participation in that one. The alternative is one focused on policy learning, where it is much more open, reflective, and it encourages people to reflect without punishment for doing so. I think the issue is still, however good the inquiry is in terms of a focus on learning, it's still situated in an adversarial process where people are just looking for identifying praise and blame. So I can't solve that one, but I think that's where we are. Maybe the last thing would be, I would say I have been a phenomenal amount of scientific type discussions about COVID, but they have largely been about either policy advisory systems or science to policy questions. They're not really about policy making, they're about the lack of impact of science or evidence on policy, and a lot of frustration there. Whereas from my perspective, you start off with the idea that there will be a huge gap between evidence to policy. I think I would say that's not fully appreciated, that from my field, you just accept that there are going to be these gaps, and then it prompts questions about how you deal with them. I think a lot of the conferences I've been to, they think there's a prospect of solving the problem that we've talked about today.
Okay. What assumption?
I agree with the sentiments in the two paragraphs that you've read, except that I think it is actually not correct to say that there hasn't been any academic debate. There may not have been many conferences, and I know how attached academics are to conferences, but there has been a very great deal of statistical and epidemiological analysis in journals and books, some of it of very high quality. I mean, I, during the pandemic, spent a lot of time, and since, reading this stuff. I mean, the material produced in the UK by the British Medical Journal, in the US by the academics in particular at Stanford and Johns Hopkins, some of it has really been extremely impressive and certainly thought-provoking. What there has been not happened is serious debate in the public sphere. And given that that is where governments are accountable to, that, I think, is a very serious gap. Unfortunately, it is characteristic of authoritarian solutions to complex problems that you tend to regard debate as a distraction and potentially as treachery because it undermines decision-making. The extreme example of that being perhaps the decision of the Victoria government in Australia to suspend Parliament altogether throughout the pandemic. That tells us something about what they thought about the value of debate on these matters. That is a problem, and I think we would do well to see how we can improve matters next time.
Thank you. Professor Miles.
I'm going to focus on part of your question, things learned as a result of our discussion over the last couple of days. Firstly, I've been very impressed by the focus here on learning lessons for policy without a focus on who was at fault, name the names, who were they, which I think is hugely more productive to do what we've been doing. I think, for me anyway, the importance of ethical considerations in making decisions, difficult ethical decisions, the importance of that has risen in my mind anyway. And communication issues in describing decisions, which I now have increasingly reached the view that are of enormous importance because they shape the behavioural responses of the public. Behavioural responses, significantly voluntary responses to perceptions of risk during a medical emergency, and shaped very much by the confidence and faith they have in the people who are making decisions and who are giving you the messages about risk. And I think those behavioural responses, voluntary behavioural responses, then have an enormous impact on what the appropriate legal restrictions should or should not be put in place. So I've learned something about the huge importance of communication and trust. And that is fortified by the fact that, if it be a fact, that they reflect ethical considerations by those who are making decisions.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask you again in the same order, just to give us, and I'll borrow Professor Kearney's words, short and punchy, please. Could you give us your thoughts, having gone through to the last 2 days, and if you would like us to particularly take away anything from this session, of these sessions? Professor Parker.
Thanks. I feel like I've said most of the thing.
Yes.
Hopefully, so this is more of a list than a.
Okay.
Which is hopefully. So the first is, I think we've all, acknowledged the importance of the ethical dimension of the decisions that get made. I think that raises interesting questions about how one integrates that expertise, relevant expertise, in practice. So some of that's going to be about expertise that helps map the values landscape around problems. But some of it, I think, potentially, actually, as I've been thinking here, there is, I think, scope for including some ethics expertise in decision-making processes as opposed to advisory processes. So, how one does that and this needs to be done in Professor Busby's point about diversity and making sure that the voices of a wide range of people, I think it's really very relevant to that. So that's one. Second is, I think, paying attention to future generations is something that's come up in my thoughts. So in terms of the costs, that's one important, but also in terms of what we can do now to ensure that the next time this happens, we as a society are better placed. And I think this inquiry is part of that process, but I also think really embedding research and international sharing of expertise is really valuable. And then the third thing, which we haven't said much about, is much of the success of a country or a community's response to an emergency is going to come down to individual people and families making decisions which have a moral dimension. We don't want, I think, partly because it won't work, governments lecturing people, and we've talked about that earlier. But I do think we need to think, well, okay, how do we try to develop a way of thinking about personal morality in this space, which could potentially be analogous to the kind of conversations we've had about climate change, for example, recycling, etc. So are there ways in which we can develop a language about this which acknowledges the responsibilities of governments and those in power, other organisations and institutions, and individual people?
Thank you. Professor Wilson. Yes.
So what we've been talking about for the last day and a half is, in a broad level, was lockdown justified? How would we tell? What kind of evidence would we need to know that? What kind of weighing of ethical values? And that I suggested that maybe an important question to reflect on at the time and for any future pandemic is, well, if we don't lock down, do we have ways of avoiding unconscionable levels of harm? And maybe what that focuses our attention on is the most important ethical questions of what kind of society are we, what kind of a society do we want to be? And that itself requires us to reflect perhaps in ways that are uncomfortable or ways that are difficult and sometimes we don't reflect on very often about how do we weigh up the value of a life, or do we think that it makes sense to say that we should allocate more money to saving the life of younger people than older people? Do we think that the state should alternatively think that saving the life of an individual should be given the same priority regardless of that individual's age? Similarly, we've thought hard about questions about how to balance liberty against harm. We haven't come up with any good solutions to those, but it seems that those are the very questions that are going to be at the heart of any future pandemic response. And that, one thing we could do at this point is throw our hands up and say, well, these are hard, they're imponderable. But maybe as a philosopher, as an ethicist, in a way that's our job to help communities patiently, carefully sort of look for better evidence, involve more people in the conversation, be able to sort of clarify slightly more about where the tensions are, what creative ways of rethinking our values in a way that they can be better reconciled with one another.
Thank you. Professor Busby?
Thank you. I think the last pandemic threw a spotlight on the interdependency that underpins our existence, but which is quite often hidden or neglected in what we might think of the private arrangements that govern our family life, our households, our paid work, the relationships we have with each other, and with institutions, including the state. And I think that by exposing this complexity and fragility and vulnerability of these arrangements, in which many engage with in their daily lives, and the ongoing difficulties that people experience due to things like precarious work, the experience of COVID could have brought clarity regarding what needs to change. I'm not sure that it has, as everything continues to return to pre-pandemic norms. But it would be, I think, a great missed opportunity if we don't think about or didn't begin the process of re-evaluating some of those norms and the assumptions on which they're based in the light of what we now know. That's why I think governments should evaluate the lessons learned, the evidence gained, and the potential alternatives as means of improving lives and avoiding disparate impacts now and in any future policy decision-making. In relation to future health crises and other emergency situations that we might find ourselves in.
Thank you very much. Professor Kearney, you originated the term short and punchy, so I'll ask you to do that, please.
Okay. the first one's the shortest one. So I think some of the words I remember, insufficient focus on trade-offs and that sort of thing. I'm still trying to think through. There's one trade-off we're kind of talking about quite a lot, which is, on the one hand, there are lots of good reasons to not have a one-size-fits-all to policy. But on the other hand, there are good reasons to communicate that everyone is being treated the same. And I think that's one of those trade-offs that people are going to struggle to navigate here. The other one, a little bit longer, is I was just reflecting on, in political science, how you measure policy success. So a lot of that's what we're talking about, evaluation. Well, how do you know if something was successful or not? And there are four, very briefly, there are four ways of doing it. One is that it's political success. So, it was popular, or enough people supported it for enough a period of time. The second one is a process. It was seen as legitimate, done through a legitimate process that enough people accepted. The third, the obvious one, is programmatic, which is that the outcomes were as expected or desired. The fourth one, I think, is more interesting in that the policy itself endured to the extent it became normalised. So often we would relate that to things like tobacco control. There's been a fundamental change in public policy on smoking over the last 30 years to the extent it's become normal and smoking has become denormalised. With lockdown, I think that's a trickier proposition. But I suppose one of my reflections is, even though lots of people today and yesterday would talk about good reasons not to lock down and high costs to doing it, it's difficult today to envisage a feasible alternative that a government will select next time. So I think unless something changes, lockdowns could become normalised simply because there is no well-developed alternative. And I think there is, so I'm hesitant to compare with other countries without publishing an article on it first, but the South Korean example, is, as far as I understand the public research, is there was a strong feeling that they dealt very badly with a previous pandemic, SARS. So there was a remarkably concerted effort to learn and change, a huge investment in disease control, lots of public campaigns to get people ready for the next pandemic, and putting in place culture changes to be able to respond. So like face mask wearing, for example, was a long-term investment in behavioural change to deal with something like COVID. And I don't think there's any equivalent to that in the UK or Scotland, where governments are encouraging long-term discussion about the next pandemic to prepare to change behaviour to deal with it.
Thank you very much. Lord Sumption, please.
There is a well-developed alternative to lockdowns, namely an approach which measures government policy according to the needs, exposures and vulnerabilities of different categories of the population. The calculation will not always be the same in every pandemic because the character of the pathogen involved will be different. But that this is a principle that should be followed seems to me to be really beyond serious argument. And I've been struck in the course of the last day and a half about the extent to which the 6 people around this table have been in broad agreement about that. The only thing that actually matters is what to do next time.
Thank you very much. And finally, Professor Miles.
Firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to come in and speaking at this inquiry. We've said many times over the last few days that people's trust of those who make decisions is of extreme importance, and this inquiry may help do some of the correct some of the impressions that people have got about governments and lack of trust in them. I hope so, anyway. 2 simple points. The first is just the huge importance, I think, of factoring into policy decisions the voluntary responses of people to information they get on the risks that they face. And I think information provided to people about risks is in some sense a substitute for restrictions. because of the strong instinct that people have to protect themselves from risks and protect not just themselves but those around them. The second final point I would like to make is that paying attention to the time horizon over which effects of policies play out, I think, is very important, and avoiding a situation where overriding weight is given to what might happen over the next several weeks as opposed to impacts that might play out over several years.
Thank you very much. Well, Lord, that concludes what I have to do at this stage, but we now move into the questions that have been posed. We have, as you are aware, received a number of questions from core participants, and some of these are for discussion around the table, and some of them are directed individually to you. I should indicate that a number of these questions were submitted in advance of yesterday and today, and I think, having reviewed them, a lot of the answers to those questions have been given in the course of the discussion that we have had. So with that observation, I'll go through a number of these questions now, if I may. The first question relates largely to care homes, and can I first of all direct this to Lord Sumption? The question is that locking down care homes was justifiable and proportionate as the pandemic developed. In that context, should regard have been had to the particular area a care home was in, for example, an island as opposed to an urban community, and or to the infection rate in the area?
Well, I am not an expert on care homes, and I think that the answers to this question and other related questions calls for expertise in problems about managing care homes, which I am simply not competent to address. All I would really say about care homes is that they constitute perhaps the most difficult single category of potential victim of a pandemic. They have many altogether exceptional features, and I think that it would be a mistake to regard them as just an example of general problems of the pandemic. They are so exceptional and so extreme, the problems associated with care homes, that one needs a tailor-made solution for them, which will not necessarily be the same as for others. I think that's the only observation that I can really relevantly make in answer to this question.
Thank you. There is a further question which I think arises out of a categorization that you've made of the problem in relation to care homes, where you use the word insoluble.
Yes.
And the question is, bearing that in mind, should they have ever been locked down?
Well, again, I mean, I think that there is a different case for locking them down in care homes than there is in the population at large, simply because this is an immobile population with relatively little autonomy in the planning of their own lives. The problem about locking them down is that it will accelerate other health issues, in particular dementia. Several of us have personal experience of relatives who are in exactly that position, and the statistics show that this was a very serious problem. So the reason why I call it insoluble is that there are probably equally powerful arguments on both sides, and I think it's worth pointing out that although in Britain we got a lot of things wrong about care homes, so did almost every other country, certainly in Europe. Sweden, which has a rather good record in most aspects of pandemic management, got care home problems badly wrong. France got them badly wrong. Germany, I'm less well informed about. But this is not a problem unique to the UK, and it's the general character of the problem illustrates how very difficult it is to deal with.
Professor Wilson, this is a question for you, and again in the context of care homes. The question is, should the Scottish Government have sought and taken into account the views of care home owners, care home residents, care home workers, and relatives of care home residents before applying restrictions to care homes? Now, obviously, you can answer this from a philosophical point of view.
Yes, so again,
that's your
my
approach.
Care homes is not my area of expertise, particularly in Scotland, but that it seems that there may be two aspects to this. I mean, in the first sort of emergency phase of the pandemic, where decisions needed to be taken about the initial lockdown very quickly, I can see it would be, even though ideally it would have been far better to have had those conversations with care home owners, residents, family members and so on, it may have been difficult within the time framework to do so with any degree of adequacy. It strikes me that having made the initial decision to have a nationwide lockdown, there was then a period of time within which to reflect on certain sort of questions about the management or guidance and regulations for care homes, and that to the extent that those running the care homes, the family members, those living in the care homes were involved in that, there seems to raise a set of questions about sort of respect for autonomy. One might sort of wonder whether in some ways it was an overreaction given the fact that many people had been discharged from hospitals without perhaps fully adequate testing into care homes, and as a result of that, maybe an overprotective response was made almost as a compensation by government. So it seems to be a serious problem, and from a philosophical, ethical perspective, the idea that sort of involving those closest to the coalface, closest to the problem in questions about how their lives will go or how they'll protect the lives of those who in their care seems to be an obvious thing to do.
Professor Miles, there are a number of questions for you, not just in relation to care homes, but generally. And I think that your discussion yesterday about the work that you carried out and the reference to your paper has really answered, I think, the bulk of the questions that have been posed for you, specifically on your empirical work. But just in connection with care homes, did that work consider restrictions in care homes as one of the elements in the balance, as it were, as to when restrictions should have been lifted based on the imbalance between the benefits and the damage?
Well, in a very indirect sense, yes, because there were tragically a very large proportion of deaths were in care homes, and the work I described yesterday, which I won't attempt to summarise again, did look at potential lives saved and deaths avoided. So to the extent that it was looking at deaths, and they were, as I say, disproportionately in care homes, it was indirectly paying attention to that. But it wasn't focused on the unique position of care homes. And I would just like to agree with things that others have said, just now said by Lord Sumption, which is that in many ways the position of care homes was unique and almost uniquely difficult. And because of that, it was rather unlikely that a blanket policy such as a lockdown, to the extent that it was applied to care homes, would have been appropriate, simply because they were in such an unusual position. And I think one of the difficulties with blanket policies was that they, almost by definition, didn't respect the very different positions that different people were in terms of risks and the costs of complying with general restrictions. And that, I think, is one reason why lockdowns should have been used very carefully, and as soon as the evidence became a bit clearer that the benefits were potentially falling beneath the costs, they should have been lifted, and the threshold for then reintroducing lockdowns should have been that much higher, perhaps, than it was the first time they were used.
Thank you. The next question again is in relation to care homes, and it involves the conflicting rights of residents and how they should be balanced. So if one is looking at the Article 2 rights, the Article 8 rights, and all this obviously in the context of an epidemic disease. You were asked as a panel, but I think specifically I can aim this at Professor Busby and Professor Wilson. How do you see that dilemma, if I can put it that way, of the Article 2 rights and the Article 8 rights being balanced?
Thank you. Yeah, we've given quite a lot of consideration to the balancing of these rights, the right to life, Article 2, and the right to private or family life, Article 8, which obviously relates to the social impacts of lockdown and other restrictions being placed on care homes. How do we balance those? I think much of the discussion already about care homes does answer that question. We have to look at the situation as it unfolds in relation to the knowledge that we have, and think about, we've mentioned all these sort of legal principles that would come into play here, proportionality and necessity. I will make up one other point actually about care homes and the evidence that might be needed to do that. And it's difficult to say with any certainty, without being in the situation, how we might put different weights on those competing interests, if I can put it that way. But what we did find in the pandemic, and this is supported by really good research on care homes in Scotland by Dr. Jenny Burton, published in Age and Ageing Journal 2024, the authors note that the care sector in Scotland was notably absent from pandemic planning and only appeared as a potential source of surge capacity to support the NHS, rather than how to protect residents. So there was a lack, I think, that research certainly bears out, in looking at these, what we might call competing interests. And of course, where we're talking about protecting residents, if we're talking about the human rights implications of that, we would also be talking about the interests of relatives and protecting residents from infection, but also thinking about how to protect residents from the lack of social interaction that they would otherwise be engaged in, which we've heard already has serious implications for dementia rates and so on. And the authors of the study that I mentioned say that this learning hasn't been done, from what they find. They say it remains problematic for current care and future pandemic management that identification in routine data of care home residents and people in receipt of care at home is still unreliable in all 4 UK countries. This research was published last year and does relate to the during COVID and the post-COVID period. I think that is a matter of some concern if we're going to think about how to manage care homes in the best way and all of the competing interests that may come into play there in the best way in future pandemics.
Thank you. Professor Wilson, I think you also have a comment on this.
Yeah, I didn't actually say anything about care homes in
my
announcement,
didn't,
but I'd be happy to say something. So I think from a philosophical perspective, thinking about the rights in play, I mean, it's maybe important to see just how difficult the conundrum is, because if we only focus on the individual in the care home who would like to be visited by a family member, they might see that maybe their Article 2 right to life is engaged, but perhaps sort of waived, or with their consent they say, I consent to the risks of my family member coming. In which case it might seem that that the right to private and family life may take precedence in that context, but that given that, as we're now fully aware, that given the nature of a care home, there may be sort of additional risks to other members of the same care home. It seems that Article 2 will still be engaged and still be very relevant, even if the individual themselves says, I'm happy to take the risk. For me, it's much more important to have that contact with my relative, even if it might increase my own risk of COVID. There's a question then of risk imposition onto other residents within the care home, and that, as far as I can see, seems to be a very difficult set of questions to resolve, and that other than sort of stating its difficulty, I don't have a lot more to say at this particular moment.
Assumption, if I can come back to you again on care homes, and it's perhaps a development of what we've been talking about. You were asked where a response to a pandemic focuses on vulnerable groups and depends on, quote, information, advice and support, which I think is what you've said, rather than coercion. Do you consider that measures in care homes could or should be based on the same principle, or would they need to be mandatory?
There is less scope for advice and support, clearly in a context where the potential victims of a pandemic are institutionalized. The institution itself involves an element of compulsory regulation of the residents' lives. So it's a rather different situation to the situation of the rest of the public, where people, the average family living as a family, will normally have a high degree, a significant range of choices to make, in making which they will be guided by advice. So I don't think the position is comparable as between care homes and the rest of the population.
And it's probably a corollary, but you probably already answered it. If not mandatory, could or should measures in care homes be left to the discretion of individual residents and their families, care home providers, or other persons or bodies?
Well, I think that certainly a family should be entitled to withdraw people from a care home if they consider that the welfare of their relative will be better served in a family context than in the care home. There were incidents, certainly in England, where families sought to do that and were prevented by the care home authorities, generally using the terms of the power of attorney, which is quite commonly taken when people go into care homes. And I think that some of those incidents were regrettable.
And can I factor into that the problem of a care home resident who does not have capacity, either through dementia or some other impairment?
In that case, it seems to me that there is no alternative but to rely either on the institution or on those members of the family who have powers in relation to the person lacking capacity.
Yes.
That's a problem that isn't peculiar to care homes, but is characteristic of people who lose the capacity to make their decisions in any context.
You're also asked, should a lockdown of a care home be lifted when the rate of infection is unlikely to exceed the capacity of hospitals to deal with it? And you referred to paragraph 7.2 of your response. Or should different criteria apply when assessing the proportionality of lockdowns in care homes?
Well, clearly the capacity of the hospital system to address the problems of residents of care homes is a relevant factor. It's not the only relevant factor. Apart from anything else, there may be conditions which are not amenable to treatment in hospitals. I think that's probably as far as I can take it.
Thank you. Professor Kearney, a brief one, or a short one for you. To what extent, if any, should the social care sector play a part in pre-pandemic planning?
Short answer, major role. Slightly longer. I think often people think of consultation as a way of helping people feel heard and to give them some ownership of the choices made, when really a lot of consultation is about gathering information from people who will carry out the decisions you're asking them to do. So I think there are things that with more involvement in planning, you could get good answers from people in social care, such as, you know, if you were to try and manage the movement of patients from health to social care, how would they do it? I mean, that would be a key question, wouldn't it be? You would have to imagine what would be actually the consequence through just thinking of through the logistics. How they would interpret care home and other isolation rules in a compassionate way that is practical given their circumstances, and how to anticipate. This is probably you know, the crucial one about when there was lockdown, it was impossible for people in social care to physically visit homes and go into their homes. So the question there would be, you know, how can you deliver a feasible alternative to home visiting? And I think my impression is a lot of those questions were answered after the fact, when really what you're looking to do is to try and answer them in advance so that you can work out if the policies you propose are going to work out as you hope.
Can I just take up one point from what you've said? Again, one of the things that this inquiry has heard a good deal about is within the health and care sector, that care homes are indeed largely what they say. They're homes. They provide a home environment for residents. And there also has to be an acknowledgement of the way in which residents interact, particularly where residents have dementia, and it's a difficulty perhaps to coerce them into acting in a way which they don't actually follow, they don't understand. So is it in that context important that the social care, the care home sector gives that individual perspective to decision makers?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in terms of providing the experiences of people who live in care homes, that there are probably more than one way to do that. In terms of, you know, representative groups, I think the other part here would be representation from the organisations who would carry out policy. I think that's one of those black boxes where people aren't quite sure what decisions people make in the name of policy. And it's so difficult to envisage, and I think that comes up as well in terms of a lot of this came down to their interpretation of the rules that they were expected to follow, that they often found ambiguous, so they would be risk averse. So I think a lot of that would be about, you know, extreme isolation of people. It may have been possible to avoid that with a more a different interpretation of the rules. But I think so. It's probably worth then governments working out how strictly organisations adhere to them, given the risks they face from non-compliance.
For all members of the panel, and it's probably something that can be answered relatively easily, I think, given the discussion we've had. Does any member of the panel consider that representatives or advocates for vulnerable groups, such as the residents of care homes, should be in any way excluded in planning for a future pandemic. Nobody's demurring from that. And similarly, for those people who are not within a care home, that again, in the context of planning for a future pandemic, people who are cared for either at home or in supported accommodation with profound multiple learning disabilities. Does anybody just demur from the proposition that they should be involved in pre-pandemic planning? Yeah.
I won't demur from that, but just a couple of thoughts that came to mind relating to the discussion. So one is, I think, I wonder, so the focus is on care homes here, but I do wonder about places where people live which have many of the features of care homes. So think, places where people have the residential places where people have support, as it were. So it may not be a care home, but it may be. And my guess is that many of those are private, but many of them chose probably to lock down. So I think there are interesting questions in that space that need to be discussed. The other thing more generally is, of course, we're talking about care homes here because of the nature of the pathogen, but there is a broader set of questions which need to be asked, and maybe not now, but which are more to do with institutions more broadly. And if you imagine a pathogen or a pandemic which affected different social groups, as it were, then we might be having this conversation about psychiatric hospitals, prisons, and other places where people have limited movement for a whole range of reasons. So there may be some questions of principle that need to be discussed here, thinking about the possibility of different forms of pandemics in the future.
Thank you. Professor Busby, a question directly for you in relation to care homes. Obviously, we know that the ability for relatives to visit was limited. Should relatives have been consulted on visitation rules? And if so, how should that have been done?
Yes, they should have been. Maybe not in all cases the fault of care homes themselves, who are responding to a changing landscape of rules and regulations. But I think as things unfolded and we came to know more about the situation that we found ourselves in, there was space for consultation and participation, especially to do with quality time spent together when that might be limited. And I do think that, yes, the loved ones, the relatives, the friends of care home residents should have been consulted. Better protocols could have been put in place to manage this based on pandemic planning, and they should have been developed in collaboration with those residents, their relatives, and staff as well. And they could have been, and I think there have been some very good alternative plans, again, put forward by groups supporting and representing those residents and their families, which should be listened to for the next time.
Thank you. Professor Wilson, final question. I think it's there are two final questions in relation to care homes. Firstly, can you explain how you consider experts by lived experience, particularly representing those with protected characteristics or other disadvantaged groups, would best be consulted and have their views heard and considered? We're talking obviously about the Scottish Government, about NPIs prior to and during the pandemic.
I would suggest via a variety of means, of which this inquiry is one of them, where it seems that, as we've discussed over the last couple of days, there's maybe two elements to pandemic planning. There's what we can do in advance to think about frameworks, try to understand better who's like to be at a greater risk, what are the additional features that people from particular groups need support within the context of an infectious disease pandemic. That work can and should be done now, and that in terms of actually how to do that practically, I mean, I would defer to others with much more experience of public engagement, but that, I mean, in my own work, I found that often it's very helpful to do something, for example, like a citizens' jury, where you assemble a representative group set of people with particular characteristics, give them sort of information, access to experts to deliberate over 2 or 3 days in order to come to some recommendations of how they what they would want to happen, which can then be, having been sort of worked up in a quite detailed way, then can be taken account of by policymakers and fed into a policy process in a way that makes it easier for those recommendations to be taken seriously, to be acted on. But that will be just one example. I think that many others will have additional ideas above and beyond that.
Thank you. Can I take out of sequence, please, for reasons I will explain in a moment, Professor Miles, on cost-benefit analysis, please. You've referred to the empirical work that you carried out and that there was the evolution of restrictions and your balance of the benefits against costs and the point at which they switched such that they occurred, that switch, in your view, occurred before restrictions were lifted. Do you have a view as to the applicability of that work to the situation in Scotland in particular?
I think so. I haven't heard that restrictions in Scotland and the evolution of the virus and the fatalities, I don't think it was so substantially different from the UK as a whole, or from England and Wales, where I largely relied on the data, that it wouldn't apply. Difficult to be sure of that, because I would need to have looked at the data specifically to Scotland, and that I did not do. And I think some of the costs are likely to play out over several years in a way that's similar. So, for example, one of the costs was the very substantial increase in waiting lists in hospitals, which I think was of a similar order of magnitude in Scotland as it was in England, something like a doubling in waiting lists in the period after COVID, which has not come back down, and that's I think one cost of lockdowns. I think also that some of the evidence on mental health, the deterioration in mental health of young people, I haven't seen any evidence it's noticeably different in Scotland from England and Wales. Some of the evidence for that is that the number of young people who are now on benefits at the highest level, sickness benefits, because they have no capability to look for work because of mental health problems, has, I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say, exploded in the period since COVID. And then there's the more general fiscal issues, which are UK-wide, of the cost of policies put in place to deal with the side effects of lockdowns, which hit the livelihoods of certain people extremely hard. The cost, as I think I mentioned yesterday, of those policies to help employed people who couldn't work, self-employed people whose businesses couldn't run, and companies that were teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, is about £150 billion. That's going to have implications right across the UK because of the effect on the overall UK fiscal position.
There's just one specific, a very specific question that I need to ask you, and that's in relation to the taking into account the experience of police officers, both in enforcing the restrictions in enforcing the restrictions, and other factors that might be relevant to consider, for example, increases in offences against officers, or other indicators of diminution of trust in policing by consent. Would it be relevant in that situation to have regard to the views of police officers and the organisation that represents them?
Well, I'm sure police officers would be able to explain exactly how difficult the period was when they were enforcing some restrictions, perhaps initially in a period where it wasn't quite exactly what the duty of police was, but even when it became clear, I'm sure there were periods when actions that you and I might have considered relatively safe were ones that the police felt obliged by the restrictions to try and enforce, which then undermined the consent and the faith and the trust of people in the police force, which is a very damaging thing, and it must make policing during that period and indeed after it very, very, very difficult. And I'm sure that in reflecting on that, the police would be able to provide better evidence than anybody about those costs, which I imagine have been significant.
Yes. Professor Miles, that brings us to just past 3 o'clock. You have other commitments that you require to leave us for. Just even at this stage, from the inquiry team, can I thank you very much for the contribution that you've made, and I'm sure His Lordship will wish to say something on that.
Indeed. I'm very grateful for your attendance and all the work you did in preparing for attendance, which has been conducive to the very interesting discussion we've had over the past day and a half. So thank you. I'm sorry you've got to leave us now, but it's entirely understandable. I think we're actually all going to take a break until past now. So thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Gill.
Thank you, my Lord. A number of questions on lockdown. The first is for Professor Parker. In paragraph 5.3 of your response, you apply the term proportionality to several different aspects of lockdown. In your view, was proportionality applied to lockdowns?
So the question I guess I can't answer is, well, there are two questions. One is, was the concept used and considered? And my experience was that those were the kinds of questions that were things that were considered, balances of various kinds, and proportionality being one of them. What I guess I can't answer in this setting is, was that balance got? I mean, I guess reflect on my own experiences, but was the question, was the balance got right, as it were? But I certainly think, to answer the question directly, that in my experience, these were exactly the kind of questions that were taken into account.
Thank you. Lord Sumption, this is a question from Scottish COVID bereaved. You've been quoted as saying that you have observed that lockdown scepticism goes with high levels of education. And you're asked, what is the empirical basis for that observation? And can I add to that? Because I'm not sure that that's necessarily something you would know. But what, if I replace empirical basis with what is the basis, what is the impression that you have that you used to inform that observation?
There's no empirical basis for it. I was interviewed by a Telegraph journalist called Philip Johnson. At the tail end of the interview, as he was going out the door, he asked me whether my friends agreed with my views about this. And I said that most of them did, and I made the comment attributed to it. It was a flippant comment. I did not expect it to receive the prominence that it did.
Thank you. Another comment that you have made is that, again from the same group, is that you have written that the UK COVID-19 inquiry was a farce, and that, and I'm quoting, no fewer than 4 branches of COVID-19 bereaved families for justice, one for each nation of the UK, have been accorded the status of core participant. They are there to argue that the government should have been more aggressive, not less. It should have locked down sooner, harder, longer. The bereaved families are victims of the virus, but we are all victims of lockdowns. Yet the only lockdown victims who have received any significant attention in the evidence are children. They were indeed badly done by, but who is there to represent the population at large? You're asked, bearing in mind what you said in support of that, do you remain of the view that the UK COVID inquiry is a farce, and if so, why?
I have not described the UK inquiry as a farce. I wrote an article critical of the way that the UK inquiry was being conducted. The word farce appeared in a headline, the headline of that article. It's an unfortunate fact that the authors of articles in newspapers do not write the headline. The headline writing is a jealously guarded prerogative of the sub-editors. Sometimes you are sent a PDF of the article as it will appear, in which case, if you don't like the headline, you have an opportunity to complain. That did not happen on this occasion, and I would not have used the word farce, and I was extremely irritated by the way in which the headline had been written. As regards the criticisms themselves, my criticism of the UK inquiry was that it was over-lawyered, that it involved too much duplication of representation, and above all, that it seemed to be obsessed with distributing blame for what happened in the past, as opposed to deciding what I've always regarded as the most useful thing such an inquiry can do, which is to advise on how we should learn lessons for the future.
Thank you very much. Professor Parker, I've got a number of questions for you. And the first is in relation to paragraph 1.6 of your response. It is said there, you discuss how it is important to take a carefully considered and flexible approach to the application of restrictions. Would taking a more regionalised, localised approach and responding to need within local areas be more responsive and therefore protect people's rights to movement?
I mean, a lot is going to depend on the facts of a particular situation, and when a virus is moving through the population in ways that are manageable at a local level, then it may well be appropriate. I think we've all agreed that public health interventions which involve a degree of restriction may be justified on occasion, but that justification needs to be made on the basis of relevant information. So it may well be that one could imagine a situation in which a regional approach might be appropriate, where a lockdown, for example, in particular, might be relevant, but that case would need to be made. I don't. Yeah.
And a further one for you: should each measure be justified generally against the specific evidence available at the time? For example, a national lockdown. Or should each measure be justified specifically against the specific evidence available at the time? For example, certain areas had higher transmission rates than others, so regional restrictions should apply? Question mark.
I mean, it's quite similar to the previous question.
Yes.
I guess my answer ultimately, it comes back to the point I made about epistemic virtue early yesterday, which was, we should make serious and well-resourced efforts to learn all we can and gather all relevant information. We should make decisions based on careful consideration of a range of considerations that we've talked about, and if regional information is useful and available, then of course it should be taken into account.
Okay. I think this is probably a very similar question. It's put that you make reference to geographic targeting of restrictions. Please, can you expand on what this might look like in practice, and how far you consider such targeting, or to zoom in by local authority, city, district, areas within cities, streets, etc.?
I mean, yeah, the answer is very similar. A national lockdown is a very, very blunt instrument, and it's also a hugely intrusive measure. And if less intrusive and less blunt measures can achieve the same goal, then they should be adopted.
Again, another for you. You make reference to intelligent interventions to achieve goals with minimum restrictions. Reference this at paragraph 7.4. And the fact that it is likely to require digital technologies. What type of technologies would be required, and what data sets would need to be captured to allow such interventions?
I mean, we discussed some of this yesterday. I think all decisions in this space should be intelligent, and by that, but I do think I'm involved, for example, in a project at the moment, bringing some ethics into a project on digital pandemic preparedness, which suggests to me at least that there may be a role in the future. There's likely to be a role, given caveating along the lines of the points about digital access and literacy and so on. There may be a role for these kinds of technologies in the future, and one would hope that they may reduce, ideally, the likelihood or need for lockdown. And this comes back to the point about individual personal behaviour, moral responsible behaviour, as Professor Miles and I have both mentioned earlier, that seems to be an important factor. So if we can enable that in a range of ways, potentially digitally, then that seems a useful thing to try to do.
Thank you. Final question at this stage for you. Mitigation strategies must include targeted support for high-risk occupations. In your view, what might this look like in practice for those working in the high-risk occupations during, obviously, the example of the COVID-19 pandemic?
There are we have, again, discussed I think there are lots of things to take into account. So some of them will be about employment rights of different kinds. You know, the right, not necessarily there is presumably legal rights associated with this, but you know, safe working environments. Also rights to do with access to employment and non-discrimination. I argued early on in the pandemic that, and this would have a cost, so Professor Miles would have views about this, that if we were expecting people to test and expecting them to respond, you know, by taking time off if their test comes back positive, then I think we also have obligations to ensure certain kinds of employment protection. So in some cases that might be providing money or other kinds of things, but in some cases it might be about ensuring that people don't lose their job because they do the right thing, or lose their housing, for example. So there'll be a range of considerations around this, and I think we didn't do enough to help people with that.
Thank you. Lord Sumption, you, again, it's a reference to your statement, both 7.5 and 14.1. Do you have any comment on how the need for non-pharmaceutical interventions was explained in the Scottish context in particular? And a follow-on, what other factors do you consider might be relevant to building public trust beyond messaging? And could work be done before any future pandemic to increase public trust?
Obviously, when one talks about public trust, there are two contexts in which one is talking about it. One is specifically in relation to the pandemic, and that is essentially a question of messaging. The other concerns trust in institutions in general, which is a more intractable subject, and I think that all one can say is that politicians need to earn trust, and some of them are better at doing that than others. On the whole, the trust that is placed in particular politicians is very much influenced by the record of that politician. I mean, without dwelling too much on this, I think it's probably right that the First Minister of Scotland her statements were received with greater respect than the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And that was, I think, attributable to the public's assessment of their track record as political personalities.
Thank you. Professor Wilson, to what extent was or should the practicality of enforcement of MPIs, such as lockdown or travel restrictions, by the authorities, in particular by the police, affect the consideration of which MPIs should be introduced and for how long? And following up that, should enforceability play a part in determining whether it is better to have an elimination strategy or a mitigation strategy?
So I think that government creates all sorts of problems for itself if it creates laws which are not enforceable, or which, if enforced as written, create so much public resistance that in fact you end up losing trust. And so it seems a rather important element of any mandatory NPIs that are put in place to think about, well, what will be the actual effect in practice? It's one thing to think that somehow we can pass a law, but the question is, well, what will the effect be of passing that law? Will it, how effective will it actually be in reducing the rate of transmission? And I think that maybe one thing that government didn't talk about, maybe for understandable reasons, is that for many epidemiological purposes, if you have, for example, sort of 90% compliance with the law, that may be enough, or it may be, you know, given the way that what you need that particular measure to do in conjunction with other measures, what you need overall is that interpersonal contact to drop enough that the rate of cases in the community will fall very steeply, and that could be quite compatible with a decent to high level of compliance with the law, but not total compliance. And so that I think there was an important but difficult question almost about what the government would want the police to do in this kind of context. So that there's a certain amount that can be done almost by presenting something, even as guidance, or the Prime Minister comes onto the TV and says, we want you to do this, and that many people are swayed more by the fact that it's a message from an authoritative figure, or it appears to be something which they're supposed to do, rather than by what's actually in the statute book. And my sense is that at the beginning of the pandemic, often you could see that police not quite knowing what to do about that, and being keen to sort of show that they're enforcing the law as required. And often there's some quite sort of things that look sort of epidemiologically rather odd, where during the first lockdown, where people who were for instance, going for a sort of long ramble in the Lake District, where there's in the middle of nowhere, where the chance of them infecting other people was utterly zero, but nonetheless arrested by police who are trying to do their job. Where you think there's a disconnect between sort of understanding of what are the sorts of behaviours that are actually likely to threaten other people, to lead to further transmission. So that in some ways you realise that for any police officer trying to enforce the law in a way that will actually be helpful to the pandemic response, there needs to be a sort of a basic understanding of what are the vectors of the disease, what are the sorts of things that would be particularly problematic in terms of disease transmission in order to focus on enforcing those particular elements. So effectively what I'm saying is that, well, either there needs to be that degree of thought in those designing the regulation in the first place, or that police need to have a sort of understanding of what the outline of the pandemic response looks like, and questions of transmission, in order to use discretion in terms of what sorts of cases to follow up on.
Another question addressed to you, and again in relation to policing. You'd identified a risk to the model of policing by consent in the event of certain types of NPIs, long-standing, constantly changing, geographically different. Do you consider that the experience of rank-and-file police officers could usefully be brought to bear in discussions around regulations and their continued appropriateness?
I think very definitely. It was just one of the features of trying to design kind of legislation at speed is, as we've heard a number of times, can easily end up being kind of blanket, and realising that the kind of the sheer differences in the context between policing in a large kind of urban context versus in a rural context. There's all sorts of differences which police officers will have kind of great sort of insights into how to work in community policing, and that, yes, it seemed to me that those insights would be really important for designing the detail, or thinking about the conditions under which discretion would be helpful, or to be able to sort of write additional guidance for the police in thinking about how to take account of particular statutory changes.
Thank you. Can I move on to the general topic of vaccines? And again, this is a question for you, Professor Wilson. Again, in your response at paragraph 11.2, you aspire to the establishment of public consensus on vaccination. Would you accept that vaccine skepticism might be more reasonable relative to a novel product, utilising a novel technology that products are more than products that are more tried and tested?
Yes, I would accept that. Having said that, I mean, maybe the important thing to emphasise, important though obvious, is that any vaccine which is going to be offered as part of a national vaccination campaign will have been fully tested. And not only that, but there'll be good surveillance, taking account of any potential side effects. And in addition to that, given that the pandemic will be worldwide, there'll be data from all other countries where that vaccine is also being used, which will be continually monitored by the UK Health Security Agency and other institutions. And so that I think there's good reasons to feel that as a citizen, what you've been offered as in terms of vaccine will be safe enough, even though it's been developed at speed, and perhaps even though it's as in the case of the mRNA vaccines, the last one, perhaps it's used a mechanism which hasn't been used before, it will have been properly tested. But yes, I think there may be reasons why individuals maybe want to hang back, say, well, I'm a bit sceptical about this, I might just want to check, and that in some ways that was one of the benefits of the way that the vaccine rollout did take place. The fact that it started with those who are at higher risk and those who are oldest, it meant that for anybody who was vaccine sceptical and somewhat younger could see that there'd been a rollout of over several weeks. Several million people had the vaccine, and the number of cases of vaccine-related harm were remarkably low, and it should have been obvious to anybody looking at the evidence that that the risk reduction you would get from the vaccine was far greater than as it were than any sort of risk that might come from the vaccine itself.
Okay. Professor Parker, for you, in relation to vaccine passports, were they ethical when considering young people, particularly given the fact that vaccines were not designed to prevent transmission nor to stop infection, but just to reduce the likelihood of severe infection? And young people were least likely to succumb to severe infection.
I'm not a scientist, but my understanding wasn't that the vaccines were deliberately designed not to stop infection and not to reduce infection. So, that vaccines are developed, and one hopes that they will do both those things. And then the evidence is gathered and assessed in the kind of way that Professor Wilson described a moment ago. So, so vaccines will be developed. They will have strengths and weaknesses, presumably, and attributes of various kinds. And then the question is, how is it reasonable to deploy them? And then the question of sort of whether activities, certain types of activities, might call for compulsory vaccination or for the kind of passports that we've just been talking about. I think it matters more if, as Lord Sumption said earlier, it matters more if the kind of activity we're talking about is one which is unavoidable, if it's your employment, for example, or if it's visiting a relative, which isn't compulsory but nonetheless important. And whereas, I can't remember what the list of activities were, but let's say it's going to a nightclub or something, then one can choose to go or not to go to a particular nightclub, and I think it's a matter of, to some degree, the organisation may consider this a reasonable thing, and they may see this as their contribution overall to reducing morbidity and mortality, and then it's up to the customers, as it were, to choose whether they want to go there or not.
Follow-on question, or a slightly different question to you. Vaccine passports, on the basis that they are ethical, do they violate an individual's right to personal autonomy?
Well, those two things related to the question of whether they're ethical or not is, to some degree at least, dependent on this question of whether they violate autonomy, and if they do, is it justified? So if one interprets autonomy in a relatively narrow way, which is to do with people's right to or opportunity to do what they want, then I think under certain circumstances it's reasonable to override that, because there are other considerations. So the question comes back to some degree to this proportionality question. I place a lot of weight on liberty and autonomy. I think these are incredibly important. So what requires justification is imposing on liberty. I mean, that would be my starting point. But it can be justified sometimes.
A further aspect of that question is, would you consider it justifiable to gather public views on these topics to inform future decisions?
If it's justify is essential. I think there is a time question. So if we're talking about thinking about the next pandemic, or if we're thinking about some issue that where there's a horizon, as it were, an opportunity for these voices to be heard, then absolutely that should be done. One can imagine situations where there's a need for something very rapidly, something urgent to be done, and in that case, efforts need to be made, but they may be less perfect than they would be otherwise. So, as one of the findings of a report that I chaired for the Nuffield Council on global health emergencies and research in that context was that engaging with relevant stakeholders was not something that could be avoided simply because it was an emergency and it was difficult. Some effort, reasonable efforts need to be made to do that.
What assumption on, again, in relation to vaccines, this is predicated on the basis that the initial advice was that being vaccinated stopped you transmitting the virus, but then information emerged that vaccines were not designed to stop you transmitting the virus. And in light of that change of information, the questioner says, some would say that viewed through the lens of human rights, forcing people to share that information is both a violation of data protection and could be seen as discriminatory. Do you have a view on that?
Well, the question really is whether the restriction on people's activities inherent in vaccine passports is justifiable. The fact that vaccines do not entirely prevent transmission is not the whole answer to the question, because as I understand it, and this is a technical question on which I imagine the inquiry will have had its own evidence, as I understand it, the viral load that is likely to be transmitted if by a vaccinated person is considerably lower than by an unvaccinated person, so that there may still be an objective justification. That seems to me to be the answer to any query based on human rights. I don't think that privacy is a problem either for exactly the same reason. There may be a justifiable reason for interfering with people's rights of privacy, and that may well be one of them. As to the Data Protection Act, I'm afraid I haven't researched this point. The Data Protection Act is an extremely complicated piece of legislation. I would be surprised if it was engaged.
Thank you. Professor Busby, there is a question for you in relation to the Pfizer clinical trial. And I understand that you, and you can say it yourself, but I understand that your view is that this requires an understanding and assessment of medical and scientific evidence, which is well beyond your expertise.
Yes, that's right. I think it is to do with pharmaceutical intervention in a way that I'm not qualified to answer, where we're looking here at non-pharmaceutical intervention. So I couldn't really answer that question.
Thank you. Professor Parker, going back to you, the question is in relation to discrimination against those who cannot be vaccinated. So emphasis on cannot. And what the questioner, which is the vaccine injury group in Scotland, says, sadly, some people experience life-altering serious adverse reactions to COVID vaccines, and some lost their lives. Vaccine passports were wiped if a person didn't present to have further vaccinations, and the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group report that GPs, doctors avoided making judgment calls and very rarely mentioned or gave exemptions. Would you say that this is a type of scenario that excludes equal treatment?
I mean, clearly, people who are going to be put seriously at risk by vaccines shouldn't be forced to have them. So that's one thing. I think if so, I don't obviously know the evidence here, but if it were to be the case that GPs or any other professional was making overly quick judgments based on that didn't were based on having thought carefully enough about these relevant considerations in the particular cases, then that could potentially be a form of discrimination. On the other hand, if they're basing their judgments on relevant facts and in the context of other considerations, then it's possible that I mean the use of vaccine. There are questions at different levels, aren't there, about the appropriateness of vaccine passports and access to, let's say, employment and so on. And then there are, that takes into account the considerations of risk that might be introduced by someone who's working, let's say, who's not vaccinated. And those will have to be judged carefully against the rights of people to have, let's say, employment in this particular case. And those will often be difficult judgments, but they're going to be based on facts of the case, I think. So, I could imagine discrimination being a problem there, but I could also imagine the exclusion of someone who hasn't been vaccinated as being perfectly appropriate under certain circumstances.
Thank you. We turn now to a number of questions on human rights. Professor Kearney, could I come to you? You've expressed, this is again from the Vaccine Injury Group, you've expressed at paragraph 12.7 of your statement your lack of confidence that the government will either understand what a human rights approach looks like or how to incorporate it into routine government business or allocate sufficient capacity to deliver it. What, in your view, needs to happen for this to be avoided?
So I think we covered a lot of this ground in terms of the distinction between hard and soft requirements. And I remember using the grammar, must, should, or could. And it's the should and the could that is relatively difficult to do something with. The only thing I reflected on here was a simple measure would be for a government to clarify what it means by a human rights approach whenever it uses a phrase. And I don't know if that's an unreasonable expectation, but sometimes it sees it simply as a useful way to reflect on ethics and other things in general. Okay, so essentially we are committed to doing the right thing. And if that's all they're doing, then good. The other times it looks like they are talking about using that perspective to underpin specific measures backed by resources. And I think, again, in that case, they should clarify that that's what they're doing. It's the uncertainty that bothers me, in that it's too easy for governments to use a language for rhetorical purposes without doing anything about it. And I think it's just good to know what they plan to do. Is it to give a good speech and aspiration, or is it to produce an outcome?
Thank you. Professor Wilson, there is a question posed for you, which is a lengthy question. It has various parts to it and delves into issues such as long COVID and the denial of long COVID when it first emerged. And looking at that from the point of view of discrimination, I think you've indicated that, again, is something beyond your particular area of expertise.
I'd be willing to speak to it briefly, as it's been asked. So in my submission, I mentioned that if you're taking a Human Rights Act and you're only considering the way in which the ECHR has been brought into Scottish law, then it's not immediately obvious, how long COVID would raise questions of human rights. I mentioned that one possible way might be that in terms of Article 14, and if discrimination in the exercise of other elements of the rights. And, and indeed, there's been quite a lot of discussion in sort of employment tribunals about whether long COVID counted as a disability. It now seems fairly clear that it can be, but there were doubts about that initially. So that my only point was there that if you were to bring the human right to health into Scottish law, then it would be kind of a clear element of the human right to health that chronic disease is a really important part of fulfilling the human right to health, whereas it's a little bit more unclear how chronic disease fits in if you're only dealing with the European Convention on Human Rights. And the second part of the question then wanted to ask about whether if people who had long COVID were prevented from sort of talking on social media, or in the words of the Scottish Vaccine Group who asked the question, was about whether it would be discriminatory to censor people. I think there would be a case there where it to happen if as it were you were speaking on from what would be in terms of the Equality Act a disability and trying to articulate your experience of that, and you felt that you were being censored in virtue of that disability, arguably you could, I mean, I'm not an expert sort of on discrimination law, but there seems to be a possible case that could be made. I mean, for reasons I was alluding to earlier in my evidence, it would appear that were a pandemic to happen in the next few years, it seems highly unlikely that particular social media platforms would engage in any such censorship, given the way things are trending at the moment.
There's a question for the whole panel, but if I could confine this to Professor Busby, because it's something that you've stated, and so you're the originator of the reason for this question. You've stated that in order to be fully effective, a human rights-based approach should ensure that the standards, content, and underpinning principles of human rights are integrated in organizational strategy and policy-making practices, as well as operationalized through the day-to-day running of organizations. All decisions resulting in policy change should be subject to equality and human rights impact assessments. Could you give your view on the importance of such equality and human rights impact assessments, firstly in relation to policy making in general and decision making, and secondly in decision making in the context of a pandemic response?
Yes, we covered some of this ground this morning, actually. So this relates to the public sector equality duty. It might relate to the Fairer Scotland duty, socio-economic duty. So, yes, this should be a matter, as I mentioned this morning, this should be something that happens already. And if it isn't happening in a meaningful way, then that's something that needs to be addressed, I think, by organisations and also by looking at the legislation and the way in which it's set out and the way in which it is implemented. But the information that's gathered through equality impact assessments is and should be built into policy making, because you're meant to do an equality impact assessment before you make a policy, before you come to a decision about how to act in a particular way. And that equality impact assessment is meant to inform that decision. And if that's not happening, then there's something going wrong there in terms of the public sector equality duty, certainly, and possibly the Fairer Scotland duty, and where we come to human rights incorporation in Scotland as something that might happen in the future, any human rights impact assessments that would be required there. In terms of decision-making in the context of a pandemic response, those kinds of equality impact assessments that should be being done could feed into that directly and should have fed into that directly, I think, in the last pandemic when it was appropriate to do that. So decision-making should have taken account of the adverse impacts that certain decisions might have had on different populations, different communities, different protected characteristic groups.
Another question for you is, what should governments take into consideration during decision-making to ensure the early intervention, support and collaboration needs of children and young people with long-term health conditions and disabilities, to ensure that they are met in accordance with the domestic and international human rights of children and young people?
Yeah, there's actually a number of human rights provisions that are potentially engaged here that should be considered, again, not just in terms of, we spoke yesterday about the difference between that hard compliance, which might give rise to litigation, for example, and using human rights as a guide to how we should behave, perhaps, in particular circumstances. So the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Protection of Persons with Disability, Article 19 provides for living independently and inclusion in the community. And also Article 24, the right to education, which talks about the importance of an inclusive education. And then the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 28, the right to education, which, as I mentioned yesterday, is incorporated into Scots law. So in taking account of those provisions and what they might mean in terms of decision-making for this particular group, and it's actually quite a large group because we're talking about children and young people with long-term health conditions and disabilities, so that could be a whole range of different things. We should look, I think, at the impact of school closures, the loss of social and educational opportunities for that group, which might have particular and did have particular mental health impacts caused by the loss of routine and certainty, and the move to online ways of operating and the reduction in face-to-face. This is particularly important and particularly impactful for neuro-untypical children, so children with neurodiversity or neurodivergent conditions. And I think that all of the rights that I mentioned there could come into play in this context if we're looking at that general rounded assessment that we should do. It's to do really with quality of life. I would also add to that that it's important in terms of respite for carers, those who care for these particular children and young people whose human rights might also be impacted by a lack of attention, if you like, to those specific rights and the impacts, the particular impacts that that group might suffer.
Thank you. Professor Kearney, something that was raised in your response to paragraph 12.7, where you say, put more starkly, the challenge is that the Scottish Government may, 1, agree enthusiastically to adopt inquiry recommendations to take forward a human rights approach to the next pandemic, but 2, not know what it means, how to fit it into routine government business, or allocate sufficient capacity to deliver this promise. This is a question from the Scottish Women's Rights Organisation. They consider that the extent to which aspirations are matched by action is an important issue for this inquiry to consider, and request that the panel, that I'll direct it to you, provides their views on how best the challenge identified by you can be addressed. Essentially, if we say something, what's the chances of us being considered?
Yeah, so I think that continues with my last answer in terms of at least trying to pin down a government on what its intentions are. Is it to, describe a philosophy or to do something tangible? That would be good. There's a particular Scottish Government context where when I was an advisor for a parliamentary committee on this kind of topic, groups routinely, the Scottish Government would routinely describe a good record on consulting with groups and coming up with good strategies. And stakeholder groups would describe feeling consulted and listened to, contributing to those strategies, but then never really hearing from the government again about what they'd done in the name. And I think there is that gap in terms of broad sincerity and practical sincerity. So I don't doubt that governments, when they use this language, have an aspiration that it would happen. I do doubt that they put enough effort into thinking about the practicalities of doing it. And the thing is that the way I described it there, I know it relates to the kind of human rights here, but actually I drew that on a study of just any vague principle that the government would, or Scottish Government would produce. I don't think this is unique to human rights approaches. I think it's just a general problem that the governments have when they try and make practical sense of very aspirational language.
Thank you. We'll bear that in mind. A few questions now on a National Ethics Committee, and these are for Professor Wilson. I'll try and roll these together if I may. What countries have a National Ethics Committee? What role did such committees play in respective states' decision-making during the pandemic? What impact do you consider that these committees had on the quality and ethical outcomes of decisions made by their respective states during the pandemic? I'll stop there.
So I did check the answer to the question of which countries have a national ethics committee, and the World Health Organization maintains a register. And there's the last update to it, they suggest that 97 countries in the world have a national ethics committee. Now, those will be sort of variably resourced. So some of them will be sort of large and expansive, such as the German Ethics Council, which I already mentioned, which has 26 members and is very well resourced. Others might be a sort of something which meets every now and again, as and when. Some of those national ethics committees only look at questions in research ethics. Others also provide policy advice. About 50 of those national ethics committees in the world do provide policy advice. Now, I couldn't find any evidence that any of the national ethics committees had been involved in the very sort of quick decision that needed to be made in order to the initial lockdown. As usually, if you wanted to get a national ethics committee involved, you need a bit of time to allow people to deliberate and so on. But that certainly there was quite a lot of evidence of national ethics committees being asked to look at particularly specific questions which are arisen, which were novel, perhaps about things like sort of digital contact tracing or vaccine certification. In those cases, we did see that national ethics committees being asked to take a view on those, and that. Again, you'll see a degree of variety across the world. In some cases, the National Ethics Committee is on a statutory footing, and so there may be almost like a duty for governments to consult it about certain sorts of topics. In other cases, it's sort of there as a potential resource that can be stood up as necessary. But certainly, I think it can be helpful, partly because of what the committee itself produces, but also because of what it means to have such a committee. The fact that if it's known that there is such a committee, then people will write about it in the press. It provides a way of shaping and giving some kind of focus to public debate. I mean, so that within the UK, there were institutions that played a similar sort of role. So that around vaccine passports, I mean, that the Ada Lovelace Institute did a lot of very excellent work on that, and produced, I think, was a really good report. I wasn't really quite sure how that particular report was fed into government decision making, but nonetheless, they had a sort of really useful process by which they sort of scoped that report. They consulted various sort of experts from across Europe. They wrote it, they drafted it in the open, and so on. So it was certainly possible for us in the UK to undertake the sorts of activities that a National Ethics Committee might have done. But in some ways, it was largely because those involving in certain institutions thought it would be really useful if we could have a robust public debate about these sort of questions, and they organised it themselves, rather than the government feeling it was something that it wanted to ask for itself.
Another question to you in relation to the National Ethics Committee. Do you feel that it would be useful for Scotland to have a National Ethics Committee or a similar body, and to what extent should the Scottish Government Equality, Inclusion and Human Rights Committee play a role?
I guess, I mean, the key question here, which maybe a question for the inquirer or someone or those who are from the Scottish Government or the Scottish people to consider is, well, do you think that the Scottish values are sufficiently different from UK-wide or as it might turn out in many cases to be English values to think that you would want to have an institution which would want to think through what it meant, what a ethical response to novel problems in a pandemic might be, taking into account Scottish values in a particular kind of way? If the answer to that is yes, then it seems obvious that yes, it would be helpful for Scotland to have a separate National Ethics Committee. For some of the reasons we've been hearing from Professor Busby, if indeed it happens that you bring on stream various of these UN human rights treaties into Scots law, I think that's going to require quite a big rethinking. So if it was me, I might consider those two as parts of the same piece. Think, well, if at the same time we're creating a whole new set of duties which will sort of require us to think much harder about sort of ethic, progressive realisation and so on, then I thought that might be a place in which you might, certainly a process of deliberation in which the question of whether to have a National Ethics Committee might be a useful part of that.
Thank you. Relates to something that you've said in your response at paragraph 12.4, and it relates to public health communication during a public health crisis, and the need to keep people informed and keep people safe, but also messaging that does not undermine the perception of authority that's necessary to ensure the same individuals continue to adhere to guidance. You're asked, are you able to provide examples of such communication or suggest measures that could be taken by governments to achieve such communication?
I guess maybe one thing I should say is, as it were, that as a philosopher, I'm not an expert on, as it were, producing good public communications. I was trying to flag that I thought it was an important question to consider. But having said that, I'll say a couple of words that maybe some of the governments which seem most impressive in the way that they handle the communication, you notice that people were able early on to latch on to metaphors which had the flexibility to be able to be adaptable as the pandemic went on, but through which they could convey in quite a concrete way what needed to be done and the moral role that they were asking their citizens to play. So that within New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern was keen to mobilise this idea of a team of 5 million. If you in a sport-mad nation, if you frame things in terms of sport, you can think of yourselves as all on the same team, also thinking about the ways in which the opposing side might be innovating and what you have to do in relation to that, so that it can provide a kind of a set of framing in which you're able to suggest that changes may be necessary, or sometimes some of the team may be on the bench. You can see it provided a flexible way of communicating some quite so difficult concepts, but in a way that allowed people to understand what was required of them and what that meant for their responsibilities to one another. So I think maybe the underlying thought is there is sort of find a set of language which is maybe sort of homely enough, approachable enough that people can get it, but also provides you with the flexibility within which to communicate changes that will be required for public policy.
Cynic might call that spin.
They might do.
They do. Another question, Professor, on the National Ethics Committee, and I think it's probably one you can answer fairly briefly. It's from the Scottish Police Federation. Essentially, in order to be effective, should such a committee, if there were to be one in Scotland, comprise, amongst others, the rank and file police officers, so that there is their input into it?
Yeah, I think it would be very, very useful to have their input.
Thank you. Lord Sumption, we're now dealing with a few of the 3 questions on international comparators. And you've mentioned on a number of occasions how Sweden handled the crisis differently, relying on voluntary measures and only restricting mass events, resulting in a far lower deaths per million than the population of the UK. I think you've probably already answered this, but I'll ask it again. Do you think that the UK culture is conducive to the same public response?
Yes.
Thank you. That's very helpful. The other question in relation to the Swedish style approach is, could you clarify whether, in your view, monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, especially in relation to employers, would have any role in the Swedish-style voluntary approach? If not, how should non-compliant actors be addressed?
As far as I'm aware, and you will have received much fuller and more authoritative evidence on this point from Dr. Anders Tegnell last week, as far as I'm aware, the only role, but it was an important one, which employers took, was that some of the advice given by the state epidemiologists to employers, such as advice on allowing people to work from home and distancing within the office, that obviously casts the responsibility for adhering to that advice directly on the employers in question. And I would imagine that an advice-based system in the United Kingdom would do the same.
Professor Kearney, you've made reference to East Asian countries, and there's an observation in your statement of paragraph 6.2 that such countries are more culturally compliant than we are in the UK. Therefore, lockdown is not as necessary. Could you just expand on that a little?
Yeah, I'm conscious we're doing a lot of generalising about cultures.
Well, I'm afraid we are.
I wouldn't presume to describe East Asian culture. But what I would say is two things. When I've seen published research that tries to explain differences between East Asian experiences and those in liberal democracies, it is about an expectation for higher levels of cultural collectivism that is reflected in state action. So there's an expectation that the state will intervene to oblige people to act in a certain way. I asked someone about this at a conference, just that question, because I guess you're just generally sceptical about this idea that people are so different. So I asked someone who was describing a South Korean experience to reflect on that image we have of people in East Asian countries about collectivism. And she described this sense that it was partly, the cultural side was about this sense of embarrassment or shame about causing someone else illness. And also, to some extent, an acceptance of the role of government there. So, I mean, I wouldn't take from that lockdown is less necessary in that context. I would take from that there is more of an expectation of the role of the state in that lockdown, which is almost the opposite point. I think what I was trying to get across is it's very difficult to draw simple lessons from countries that seem so different. And the lesson I would take from East Asian experience or this collection of countries is that you could see a huge response to a previous epidemic about preparing for the next one in a particular way. And that preparation was about high investment in disease control, high investment in ways to try and encourage behavioural change in the population so that the state was prepared and people were prepared. And I think what I was trying to make a comparison there with was I don't see either of those things in the UK. Therefore, I think what people said about South Korea was they provided an alternative to a highly restrictive lockdown for everyone by providing a way for almost entire restrictions for anyone suspected of being infected. And I think in the absence of that in the UK, I think they're much more likely to rely on a much more blanket coverage because they don't have that kind of alternative.
Thank you. Lord Sumption, a question for you again on comparators. You've said at paragraph 12.2 of your statement, you make reference to European plans for pandemics published by the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. And you're asked, was there any of these plans that stood out to you as being the most sensible, or any aspects of the plans that you can recall that you would like to bring to our attention?
All of these plans were submitted to the European Centre for Disease Control well before the pandemic, and they were published by the Centre for Disease Control early in February 2020. I read as many of them as my linguistic abilities allowed. but in some cases I was also able to draw on the linguistic abilities of other people. So I probably read about 18 or 20 of the 27, 28 in fact at the time, because they included the United Kingdom. The ones that impressed me most were those produced by the United Kingdom as part of their pandemic plan, revised most recently in 2017, and the ones produced by the highly authoritative Robert Koch Institute in Germany. I thought they both actually were broadly in line. Both of them emphasized initially that it was important to treat people like grown-ups, because they were that way more likely to behave that way. They said that one should lean against coercive measures and endeavor to ensure that so far as feasible, life continued as close to normal as the pandemic permitted. That represented the orthodoxy of the way in which previous pandemics had been dealt with, notably the Hong Kong and bird flu epidemics of the 50s and 60s. And I think that it was unjustifiably ignored, certainly in the United Kingdom, and I have to say also by the German government, which I think paid lip service to the Robert Koch views. The Robert Koch Institute, I think, made some critical observations about the way that their plans had been disregarded. So I thought that those were the most impressive contributors to that debate, but I'm not saying that they were the most influential on what followed.
Okay. My Lord, we're approaching a time where I think we need to draw stumps on this particular exercise. There's one other question I would like to ask. We need a few moments for your Lordship to indicate where we're going and make some concluding remarks. It is one question finally for Lord Sumption. And this is in relation to your 95-year-old friend that you refer to, and your reference, paragraph 6.3, that she would have preferred to spend her remaining time with others and take the risk of COVID rather than be isolated. The question is, do you perceive that the priority was to protect the NHS from being overwhelmed rather than uphold the right to life for individuals? And from a legal perspective, should an individual have the right to choose which right they want upheld, to live longer or to have freedom of movement? Can I ask you just to confine yourself to the last part of that question?
Yes, I do think that one should have that choice. I think that this is an example about an old person absolutely classically in the vulnerable category. I think that if one wishes to take a risk and it doesn't adversely affect other people, one should be free to do so. Now, the only respect in which the questioner suggests that this would have adversely affected other people is that it might have resulted in this lady occupying a bed in a national health hospital. It seems to me that it can't be a conclusive argument against someone's right that they might come to need the services of a facility like the National Health Service.
Thank you very much. My Lord, the position is that we still have a number of questions that we have agreed to accept. We simply don't have the time to deal with them in the oral session, but what we will do and offer to do is that the remaining questions we will get answers and communicate those to the core participants in writing. So with that, my Lord, that concludes my role in these hearings. I would like to thank all the members of the legal team of the inquiry and indeed the wider inquiry team for all the work that they put into this exercise, to thank the legal team in particular for the way in which they have organised matters and in particular organised the various questions that have come in, to Melena Jr. for the help that she has given to us in sorting these questions, and certainly without that help I certainly would have been overwhelmed. But most importantly, I would like to thank each and every one of our panel for the input that they have given over the last 2 days. Were I not to have been the ringmaster, I'm sure I would have enjoyed it much more as an observer, but I have found it stimulating and very enjoyable.
Before I let you finally off the hook, I think as a matter of politeness, I should ask all 5 of the witnesses. It's going to be difficult to ask Professor Miles. I've elevated him in his absence, but I should ask if they are happy to cooperate in answering any of the questions, as I see their names are attached to some, or some of your names are, so you may expect begging letters in the next few weeks. I hope that's amenable and agreeable to you all. Thank you very much indeed. Right, with that, can I now thank Lord Sumption, Professor Miles, Professor Busby, Professor Parker, Professor Kearney and Professor Wilson for all their help, all their assistance they've given us, and the considerable amount of time, both in preparation and in dragging themselves, apart from Professor Kearney, to the far north for the purposes of, well, we can't say the weather's too bleak yet, but putting up with the weather in Edinburgh and being here. I'm very grateful to you all. Thank you. That then concludes this set of hearings on lockdowns, which we've held over the last 2 weeks. I'd like to thank all the expert witnesses who participated in those discussions over that period and, of course, have left and are no longer here. In common with the impact evidence that has already been heard and considered by the inquiry, the evidence we've heard over these 2 weeks will assist us in preparing to question Scottish ministers about how they came to the decisions to impose restrictions on people's life. Thus far, in total, the inquiry has taken 681 witness statements and cited 396 witnesses to give evidence. In parallel to preparing for and delivering these hearings, the inquiry has been and continues to be engaged in the investigation of the implementation and decision-making phases of the inquiry's work. That work includes considering hundreds of thousands of pages of evidence and statements to ensure that the evidence that is crucial to the inquiry's work is identified and considered. It also includes investigating the actions of those organisations responsible for implementing the strategic decisions of the Scottish ministers, such as local authorities, COSLA, Public Health Scotland and NHS boards. As I have indicated previously, our aim is not to duplicate evidence already heard by the UK COVID-19 inquiry. Where evidence produced to the UK inquiry is considered by this inquiry for the purposes of hearings, it will be issued to co-participants as part of the inquiry bundle. Those authors of documents or statements will not be called by this inquiry to repeat evidence they have already provided. Such witnesses will only be called where the inquiry seeks additional evidence from them in respect of the same or other matters. This will avoid repetition at our oral hearings and incurring unnecessary cost, but it is also a substantial task and will take a considerable amount of time. Once the evidence has been analysed and it is reasonable to anticipate that we may call some of the same witnesses as were called by the UK inquiry to answer different and additional questions based on our terms of reference and investigations. As I've said, investigating work is progressing well, but it is not presently possible to provide a precise date in 2026 in which implementation and decision-making hearings will commence. I am, however, able to advise that the inquiry will hold a preliminary hearing on Tuesday the 3rd of March 2026 to provide further details of our hearing schedule, which we should be able to facilitate and provide by then. So until the 3rd of March 2026, I will adjourn these proceedings. Thank you all very much for your attendance today. Thank you all.